12-year-old boy who could heal anyone with just his touch, until the very doctors who promised to help him became his killers. In 1892, Elijah Moore possessed a gift that modern science still can't explain. Broken bones mended in days, deadly fevers disappeared instantly, infections healed without scars. Desperate families traveled hundreds of miles just to reach this miraculous child. But when Dr. Sarah Chen discovers her ancestors' hidden journal in her grandmother's attic, she uncovers a truth so horrifying it's been buried for over 150 years. Timothy wasn't just a patient. He was an experiment. The trusted doctor who studied him wasn't trying to understand his gift. He was trying to steal it. And when Timothy's small body began failing from the brutal treatments, they didn't stop, they covered it up. Now the same family that profited from Timothy's death is worth hundreds of millions, and they'll do anything to keep their ancestors' crimes hidden. But Sarah won't let them silence Timothy again. The question is, when you're fighting a conspiracy that's lasted over a century, how do you prove a murder that powerful people will kill to keep secret? The house on Elm Street had been Rose Chen's sanctuary for 43 years. A modest craftsman bungalow with morning glories climbing the front porch and a kitchen that perpetually smelled of jasmine tea and homemade bread. Now, 3 weeks after Rose's funeral, it felt like a museum of a life well lived. Each room holding stories that only Sarah remained to remember. Sarah moved through the familiar spaces with a methodical precision that had made her a reputation in academic circles, but her usual analytical detachment kept fracturing against waves of unexpected emotion. Here was Rose's reading chair, permanently indented where she'd spent countless evenings with medical journals and mystery novels. There was the kitchen table where she'd helped Sarah with homework, later with graduate school applications, and finally with job interview preparations, always believing that her granddaughter could unlock any secret the past had hidden. The dining room held Rose's collection of antique medical instruments, a hobby that had sparked Sarah's own fascination with historical medicine. Rose claimed she'd inherited her interest from ancestors who knew things about healing, but she'd always been vague about family history, deflecting Sarah's questions with gentle smiles and promises to tell those stories someday when you're ready to hear them. That someday would never come now. Sarah's phone buzzed with another condolence text, probably from Dr. Martinez at the university, asking when she'd be ready to return to her research. The truth was, she didn't know. For 3 years, she'd been chasing a tenure-track position that always seemed to slip just beyond her grasp, publishing papers on obscure medical anomalies that impressed her peers but never quite broke through to broader recognition. Rose had been her anchor through every rejection letter, every conference presentation that fell flat, every moment when Sarah wondered if she was wasting her life studying dead people's mysteries. You find the stories that matter, sweetheart, Rose had said during Sarah's last visit, her voice already weakened by the cancer that would claim her 2 weeks later. The ones that still have something to teach us about being human. The memory made Sarah's chest tighten. She forced herself to focus on the task at hand, sorting Rose's belongings into keep, donate, and storage categories. The process felt simultaneously necessary and sacrilegious, like dismantling a shrine that should remain untouched forever. Most of Rose's papers were predictably organized. Medical bills in manila folders, tax records bound with rubber bands, correspondence filed chronologically. But as Sarah worked her way up to the attic, she found herself slowing down, reluctant to disturb the accumulated sediment of Rose's private world. The attic ladder creaked ominously as Sarah climbed into the dusty space under the eaves. Rose had always been sparing in her use of the attic, claiming her arthritis made the climb too difficult, but the space was surprisingly full. Boxes labeled in Rose's careful handwriting lined the walls. Sarah's school projects, holiday decorations, 01980. Sarah smiled despite her sadness. Even Rose's storage was organized with loving precision, but as she moved deeper into the space, following the beam of her flashlight, Sarah noticed something odd. In the far corner, several floorboards seemed slightly raised, as if the wood had warped over time, or as if something had been hidden beneath them. Her academic instincts kicked in, overriding her grief. Sarah knelt and ran her fingers along the edge of the suspicious boards. They shifted slightly under pressure, revealing a gap wide enough to slip her hand through. Whatever Rose had hidden here, she'd wanted it to stay hidden. Sarah worked one board free, then another, until she could reach into the space beneath. Her fingers touched something wrapped in oilcloth, carefully protected from moisture and time. She lifted it gently, her pulse quickening with the familiar thrill of discovery. Inside the oilcloth was a medical journal bound in cracked leather, its cover stamped with gold lettering that had mostly worn away. The first page bore a date that made Sarah's breath catch: September 15, 1892. Below that, in careful script, the medical observations of Dr. Marcus Whitmore concerning the case of Elijah Moore, aged 12 years. Sarah sat back on her heels, mind racing. Rose had never mentioned owning any medical documents from the Civil War era. In fact, she'd always claimed that most family records had been lost in a house fire decades before Sarah was born. Why would she have hidden this particular journal? The pages crackled as Sarah opened the journal, revealing detailed medical observations written in multiple hands. Dr. Whitmore's formal script dominated the early entries, but other voices appeared as the journal progressed. Nurses, colleagues, and eventually family members recording their own observations about Elijah Moore. According to the entries, Timothy was a 12-year-old boy living in Millbrook, Massachusetts, who had somehow developed the ability to accelerate healing in others through physical contact. The documentation was meticulous: detailed case studies, sketches of injuries before and after Timothy's intervention, testimonials from witnesses, even crude attempts at scientific measurement. Sarah flipped through pages of increasingly urgent documentation. Here was a mill worker whose crushed hand had healed completely after Timothy's touch. There was a child whose fever had broken instantly when Timothy held her hand. Page after page of impossible recoveries, all carefully documented by medical professionals who seemed as baffled as they were convinced. But as Sarah read deeper, she noticed something troubling. Several pages had been torn out, leaving only jagged edges where crucial information had once been recorded. Someone had deliberately removed parts of Timothy's story. Then, near the back of the journal, Sarah found something that made her heart stop. Tucked between pages was a faded daguerreotype photograph showing a slight boy with an otherworldly expression, and one distinctive feature that Sarah recognized immediately: heterochromia. One blue eye, one green, exactly like Rose had possessed. Sarah's hand trembled as she studied the photograph. Rose had always claimed her unusual eyes were a family trait passed down through generations, but she'd never mentioned anyone specific. Now, staring at Elijah Moore's young face, Sarah saw an unmistakable family resemblance, not just in the eyes, but in the shape of the nose, the stubborn set of the jaw, even the way he held his head slightly tilted when posing for the camera. The implications hit her like a physical blow. Rose hadn't just inherited a random medical journal. She'd been preserving the story of her own ancestor, a boy whose extraordinary abilities had been documented and then deliberately obscured by history. Sarah sat in the dusty attic, surrounded by the detritus of Rose's life, holding what might be the key to understanding not just a historical mystery but her own family's hidden past. Rose's vague answers about their family history suddenly made sense. She'd been protecting Timothy's story, waiting for the right time to share it, or waiting for the right person to discover it. Sarah's phone rang, jolting her back to the present. Dr. Martinez's name appeared on the screen, but she let it go to voicemail. For the first time since Rose's death, she felt a spark of the excitement that had originally drawn her to historical research. This wasn't just an academic puzzle, it was personal. Elijah Moore was family, and someone had tried to erase his story from history. Rose had made sure that wouldn't happen. As Sarah carefully rewrapped the journal and prepared to climb down from the attic, she felt Rose's presence more strongly than she had in weeks. Not the crushing weight of loss, but the warm certainty that some discoveries happen exactly when they're meant to happen. Elijah Moore had been waiting 157 years for someone to tell his complete story. Sarah intended to make sure he didn't have to wait any longer. The rain had stopped while she'd been in the attic, and afternoon sunlight streamed through the dusty windows, illuminating motes of dust that danced like spirits welcoming her back to the world of the living. Sarah tucked the journal under her arm and began planning her research strategy, feeling more like herself than she had since Rose's death. Some stories she was beginning to understand were too important to stay buried, no matter how powerful the people who wanted them hidden. Sarah's apartment near the University of Portland campus had always been her refuge, a carefully curated space where historical artifacts shared shelf space with modern conveniences, where the past and present coexisted in comfortable harmony. But now, with Timothy's journal spread across her dining room table like evidence in a cold case, the familiar surroundings felt charged with new possibility. She had spent the past 3 days doing preliminary research, approaching Timothy's story with the methodical rigor that had earned her PhD. The historical context was fascinating. 1892 had been a year of tremendous upheaval in American medicine, with the Civil War having accelerated medical innovation while simultaneously creating widespread skepticism about miraculous claims. Faith healers and medical charlatans had proliferated during the war years, taking advantage of desperate families and wounded soldiers. But Timothy's case seemed different. Dr. Whitmore's initial observations showed the careful skepticism of a trained physician. His early entries documented attempts to debunk Timothy's alleged abilities, testing for fraud or deception with the thoroughness of a man who expected to expose a hoax. Instead, he'd become a believer. Sarah had cross-referenced the names mentioned in the journal with historical records, finding corroborating evidence for many of Timothy's alleged healings. Newspaper archives from the Millbrook Gazette mentioned the miraculous boy who had drawn visitors from across New England. Massachusetts state records confirmed the existence of Dr. Marcus Whitmore, a respected physician who had served as an army surgeon during the Civil War. Everything checked out, which made the missing pages even more intriguing. On Thursday evening, Sarah made a decision that would have seemed impossible a week earlier. She picked up her phone and dialed the number for Janet Morrison, the head librarian at the Millbrook Historical Society. If Timothy had lived in Millbrook, someone there might have records that could fill in the gaps in his story. Millbrook Historical Society, this is Janet speaking. The voice was warm but professional, with the slight rasp of someone who'd spent decades answering questions and guiding researchers through the maze of local history. Mrs. Morrison, this is Dr. Sarah Chen from the University of Portland, researching a historical medical case from 1892, and I'm hoping you might be able to help me access local records. 1892? That's an interesting year for us. What specific case are you researching? Sarah took a deep breath. Elijah Moore, a 12-year-old boy who apparently had some kind of healing ability. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that Sarah wondered if the call had dropped. Then Janet's voice returned, quieter but more intense. Dr. Chin, may I ask where you heard about Timothy? The question caught Sarah off guard. She'd expected either recognition or puzzlement, not this careful probing. I found a medical journal documenting his case. Why? Is there something I should know? Another pause. Dr. Chen, would it be possible for you to come to Millbrook? I think we need to have this conversation in person. 3 days later, Sarah found herself driving through the hills of western Massachusetts, following GPS directions to a town that seemed frozen somewhere between the 19th and 21st centuries. Millbrook had clearly once been a thriving mill town, but the massive brick factory buildings now housed artists' studios and antique shops, their smokestacks silent monuments to an industrial past. The Millbrook Historical Society occupied a converted Victorian mansion on the town's main street, its wraparound porch decorated with historically accurate gingerbread trim and a sign promising local history, genealogy research, and community archives. Sarah parked under a maple tree whose leaves were just beginning to show autumn colors, feeling the familiar flutter of anticipation that preceded any significant research discovery. Janet Morrison turned out to be a woman in her early 70s with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun and eyes that missed nothing. She greeted Sarah at the front door with a mixture of curiosity and caution that immediately put Sarah on alert. Dr. Chen, thank you for making the trip. Please, come in. We have a lot to discuss. The Historical Society's main room was a researcher's dream, floor-to-ceiling shelves filled with bound volumes, filing cabinets labeled with decades of local records, and display cases showcasing artifacts from Millbrook's industrial heyday. But Janet led Sarah past all of this to a small office in the back of the building, closing the door behind them with deliberate care. "Before we begin," Janet said, settling into a chair across from Sarah, "I need to ask you again, where exactly did you find information about Elijah Moore?" Sarah had prepared for this question during the drive, but something in Janet's manner made her decide on complete honesty. She pulled Timothy's photograph from her research folder and placed it on the desk between them. "I found this in my grandmother's attic, along with a medical journal documenting Timothy's case. My grandmother recently passed away and she never mentioned having any historical documents, but I think Timothy might have been our ancestor." Janet picked up the photograph with trembling hands, studying it intently. When she looked up, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Oh my goodness, I never thought I'd see this photograph again." "Again?" Janet rose and moved to a filing cabinet in the corner of the office, withdrawing a manila folder that looked like it had been handled countless times over the years. She returned to her desk and opened the folder, revealing photocopies of letters, newspaper clippings, and what appeared to be genealogical charts. "Dr. Chen, my great-great-grandmother was Emma Morrison. She was one of the people Timothy healed in 1892. She wrote letters about her experience, letters that my family has preserved for 5 generations. Janet's voice grew stronger as she spoke. "Emma was dying of consumption when Timothy touched her hand. She lived for another 63 years after that day." Sarah felt the familiar chill that accompanied major historical discoveries. "You've been researching Timothy too?" "My whole life," Janet admitted. "Emma's letters were the reason I became a librarian. I wanted to understand what happened to Timothy, why his story disappeared from the official records. I've been collecting fragments of information for decades, hoping someday I'd find enough pieces to understand the complete picture." Janet opened another folder, revealing copies of death certificates, property records, and medical documents. "Timothy died in December 1892, just 3 months after the last entry in Dr. Whitmore's journal. The official cause of death was listed as respiratory failure due to constitutional weakness, but Emma's letters suggest something else entirely." "What do you mean?" "Emma wrote that Timothy had become increasingly ill in his final weeks, not from his usual frailty, but from something else. She described him as being poisoned by those who claimed to help him. Her letters mentioned Dr. Whitmore giving Timothy medicines that made him worse, not better." Sarah's mind raced. "Are you suggesting Timothy was murdered?" "I'm suggesting," Janet said carefully, "that someone didn't want Timothy's story to continue, and they were willing to do whatever it took to silence him." The two women sat in silence for a moment, the weight of history settling between them. Finally, Sarah spoke. "Janet, I think we need to work together on this. Between your research and my grandmother's documents, we might be able to piece together what really happened to Timothy." Janet nodded slowly. "Dr. Chin, there's one more thing you need to know. You're not the first person to come looking for information about Elijah Moore. Over the years, I've had several inquiries from people claiming to represent the Whitmore family. They've offered substantial sums for any documents related to Timothy's case." "What did you tell them?" Janet's smile was grim. "I told them that some stories are too important to sell, but I think it's significant that the Whitmore family is still trying to control Timothy's narrative 157 years after his death." Sarah felt pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to click into place. Timothy's healing abilities, Dr. Whitmore's documented involvement, the missing pages from the journal, and now evidence of an ongoing cover-up stretching across more than a century. This wasn't just a historical mystery anymore. It was a case of historical injustice that had never been resolved. And for the first time since Rose's death, Sarah knew exactly what she needed to do. The partnership between Sarah and Janet developed with a natural rhythm of two researchers who recognized kindred spirits in each other. Over the following weeks, they established a routine. Sarah would drive to Millbrook on weekends, bringing copies of Rose's documents, while Janet shared her decades of accumulated research and provided access to the Historical Society's archives. Janet's office became their war room, its walls soon covered with timeline charts, genealogical trees, and photocopy documents that painted an increasingly complex picture of Elijah Moore's brief life. What emerged was not just the story of a boy with extraordinary abilities, but a glimpse into the social and medical tensions of post-Civil War America. "Look at this," Sarah said during their third working session, spreading out a series of newspaper clippings Janet had collected from various New England papers. Timothy's story was bigger than just Millbrook. The Boston Herald ran a series of articles about him in October 1892. The New York Tribune sent a correspondent to investigate. He was becoming a national phenomenon. Janet nodded, pulling out a folder of correspondence she'd discovered in the Historical Society's uncatalogued archives. And that's when the pushback started. These are letters to the editor from various medical societies, questioning Timothy's legitimacy. But look at the timing. They all appeared within days of each other, as if they were coordinated. Sarah studied the letters, noting the similarity in language and arguments. Someone was organizing opposition to Timothy's story. The question is, who and why? Their research revealed that Timothy's healing sessions had drawn people from across social and economic lines. According to Emma Morrison's detailed letters, Timothy had healed a freed slave woman whose infected leg wound doctors refused to treat, restored sight to a mill worker who'd been blinded in an industrial accident, and even helped children whose wealthy families had exhausted conventional medical options. He didn't discriminate, Sarah observed, reading through testimonial after testimonial. Rich or poor, white or black, Timothy helped everyone who came to him. In 1892, that would have been controversial in itself, but the most intriguing discoveries came when they began cross-referencing Dr. Whitmore's journal entries with other contemporary sources. Janet had found references to Timothy in the personal diary of Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, one of the first women physicians in Massachusetts, who had visited Millbrook in November 1892. Dr. Hartwell's observations painted a different picture of Timothy's final weeks than the optimistic tone of Whitmore's official journal. She described a boy who was clearly unwell, not from his usual constitutional weakness, but from what she suspected was mercury poisoning, a common side effect of the experimental treatments many physicians used during that era. Hartwell was suspicious of Whitmore's methods, Sarah said, reading from the diary excerpt Janet had painstakingly transcribed. She writes that Timothy appeared increasingly listless and confused, and that his remarkable ability seemed to be diminishing rather than strengthening under Whitmore's care. Janet leaned back in her chair, processing the implications. So either Whitmore was incompetent, or he was deliberately experimenting on Timothy with dangerous treatments. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at it and froze. "What is it?" Janet asked, noticing Sarah's change in expression. "Someone wants to meet with me about Elijah Moore. Someone named Miguel Santos. He says his family has information about Timothy that I need to hear. They agreed to meet at a coffee shop in Portland the following Tuesday." El Santos turned out to be a man in his 40s with calloused hands and kind eyes, wearing work clothes that suggested he'd come directly from a construction site. He carried with him a worn leather satchel that he handled with the reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts. "Dr. Chin, thank you for agreeing to meet with me. I saw your name in an online genealogy forum where someone had posted questions about Elijah Moore. My family has been waiting a long time for someone to take his story seriously." Miguel opened his satchel and withdrew a collection of items that made Sarah's pulse quicken. Handwritten letters in Spanish and English, a small wooden cross, and what appeared to be a piece of fabric with strange intricate embroidery. "My great-great-grandfather was Roberto Santos. He worked in the Millbrook textile mill in 1892. According to our family stories, Roberto was badly injured in a machinery accident that should have killed him. Elijah Moore saved his life." Miguel unfolded one of the letters, its pages brown with age but still legible. Roberto couldn't read or write, but his wife could. She wrote down everything Roberto told her about Timothy, and she made sure the story was passed down through our family. We've kept these letters for over 150 years. Sarah accepted the letter with hands that trembled slightly. The Spanish text was beyond her ability to read, but Miguel had prepared a translation that brought Roberto's experience to vivid life. The boy's hands burned like fire, but not in a way that hurt. Miguel read aloud, I felt the broken bones in my chest knitting together like my wife's knitting needles weaving wool. When he stepped back, I could breathe without pain for the first time in weeks, but I saw something in his eyes that troubled me. A sadness too deep for one so young, as if he carried the weight of everyone's suffering. Why they carried the weight of everyone's suffering. The letter went on to describe Timothy's living conditions, which seemed inconsistent with someone who was drawing visitors from across New England. According to Roberto's account, Timothy lived in a small room above a boarding house, with Dr. Whitmore controlling access to him and managing all financial donations that people brought to express their gratitude. Roberto wrote that Timothy was always tired, always hungry, and that Dr. Whitmore kept giving him medicines that made him sicker instead of stronger. Miguel continued. Roberto tried to bring Timothy food, but Whitmore wouldn't allow it. He said Timothy needed to maintain a special diet for his abilities to work properly. Sarah and Miguel spent 3 hours going through the Santos family documents, which included not just Roberto's testimony but letters from other Latino workers who had witnessed Timothy's healings. The picture that emerged was of a boy who was being systematically exploited by the very people who claimed to be protecting him. Miguel, would you be willing to share these documents with another researcher? There's a librarian in Millbrook who's been investigating Timothy's story for decades. Together, we might be able to piece together what really happened to him. Miguel's response surprised her with its intensity. Dr. Chen, my family has been waiting over 150 years for someone to tell Timothy's complete story. Roberto made us promise to keep the truth alive until someone came who could do something about it. If you think you can give Timothy the justice he deserves, then yes, absolutely. The following weekend, Sarah brought Miguel to Millbrook to meet Janet. The three of them spent an entire Saturday comparing documents, cross-referencing testimonies, and building a comprehensive timeline of Timothy's final months. What they discovered was both heartbreaking and infuriating. Elijah Moore had been a genuinely extraordinary child, whose healing abilities had been documented by multiple credible witnesses. But instead of being protected and cherished, he had been exploited by Dr. Marcus Whitmore, who had seen Timothy not as a patient to be cared for, but as a commodity to be managed and monetized. The missing pages from Whitmore's journal appeared to document the doctor's increasingly desperate attempts to enhance and control Timothy's abilities through experimental drugs and treatments. Janet had found references in other contemporary sources to Whitmore's financial difficulties and his connections to wealthy investors who were interested in commercializing Timothy's gift. Timothy wasn't Dr. Whitmore's patient, Sarah said as the three of them sat surrounded by evidence. He was Whitmore's business opportunity. And when the treatment started killing Timothy, Whitmore covered it up to protect his reputation and his financial backers. Jeanette pulled out a folder she'd been saving for last. There's one more thing you both need to see. I recently found this in the personal papers of the town's undertaker from 1892. The document was a brief handwritten note describing the condition of Timothy's body when he died. The undertaker had observed signs consistent with heavy metal poisoning, discolored fingernails, hair loss, and organ damage that couldn't be explained by Timothy's supposed constitutional weakness. Someone killed Elijah Moore, Miguel said quietly. And then they made sure no one would ever be able to prove it. Sarah felt the familiar fire that had driven her academic career, but now it was personal. Timothy wasn't just a historical subject. He was family, and he deserved justice, even if it came 157 years too late. We need to go public with this, she said. Timothy's story needs to be told completely and honestly. But first, we need to find out if the Whitmore family is still trying to control his narrative. Janet and Miguel exchanged glances. Sarah, Janet said carefully, there's something else. I didn't mention it before because I wasn't sure how seriously to take it, but I've been getting phone calls recently. Someone claiming to represent a pharmaceutical company has been asking about Elijah Moore documents. They've offered to purchase any materials the Historical Society might have. What kind of pharmaceutical company? Whitmore Chin Pharmaceuticals, Janet said. Based in Boston. They claim they're researching historical medical cases for a corporate heritage project. Sarah's blood went cold. Whitmore Jen? Are you sure about the name? Positive. They've called 3 times in the past month, always asking the same questions about Elijah Moore documents and whether we know of any family descendants who might have additional materials. The implication hit Sarah like a physical blow. Someone with the Whitmore name was still actively trying to control Timothy's story, and they had enough resources to conduct what appeared to be a systematic search for anyone who might possess evidence of their ancestors' crimes. For the first time since discovering Timothy's journal, Sarah felt a chill of genuine fear. This wasn't just historical research anymore. This was a confrontation with people who had been covering up the truth for over a century and clearly had no intention of stopping now. But Sarah also felt something else. The fierce determination that had driven her through graduate school, through every academic challenge, through the grief of losing Rose. Elijah Moore had been silenced once by people who valued profit over human life. She wouldn't let it happen again. The partnership between Sarah, Janet, and Miguel had evolved into something deeper than academic collaboration. It felt like a mission. For the past month, their weekend research sessions had become the focal point of Sarah's week, the first thing that had given her life meaning since Rose's death. But as their investigation deepened, so did the sense that they were walking into dangerous territory. Sarah had been having trouble sleeping, her dreams filled with images of Timothy, sometimes as the gentle boy from the photograph, sometimes as a victim crying out for justice that never came. We'd taken a leave of absence from the university, officially to handle Rose's estate, but really because she couldn't concentrate on anything except Timothy's story. The breakthrough came when Miguel suggested they expand their search to include other families whose ancestors had been healed by Timothy. Using genealogy websites and local historical societies, they'd identified 12 families across New England who had oral traditions mentioning Elijah Moore. Each family has pieces of the puzzle, Sarah explained to Janet during one of their research sessions. The Kowalski family in Connecticut has letters describing Timothy healing their ancestors' tuberculosis. The Washington family in Vermont has a diary entry about Timothy helping their great-great-grandmother during a difficult childbirth. Even taken individually, these accounts are remarkable. Together, they paint a picture of a boy who saved dozens of lives, but they also revealed a pattern that chilled Sarah to the bone. In every case, the family's contact with Timothy had ended abruptly in late November 1892, just weeks before his death. According to multiple sources, Dr. Whitmore had suddenly restricted access to Timothy, claiming the boy needed to focus on advanced medical treatments that would enhance his abilities. Janet had been tracking down contemporaneous medical records, and what she'd found supported their worst suspicions. I contacted the Massachusetts State Archives and requested any available records related to Dr. Marcus Whitmore's medical practice. They found his license renewal applications from 1892 and 1868. She spread the documents across their work table. Look at the financial disclosures he was required to submit. In 1866, Whitmore reported annual earnings of $400.00, which was typical for a small-town physician. But in 1892, he reported earnings of over $3,000.00, an increase of more than 600% in a single year. Sarah studied the numbers. Timothy's healing sessions has to be, but here's what's really interesting. Whitmore's 1868 renewal application shows his earnings dropped back to $450.00. Whatever business model he'd developed around Timothy died with the boy. Miguel had been quiet during this exchange, but now he spoke up. My grandmother used to tell me something Roberto said about Dr. Whitmore. He said the doctor changed during Timothy's final weeks. Roberto described him as becoming desperate and cruel, pushing Timothy to heal more people than his body could handle. I felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. Whitmore was under pressure. He'd made promises to investors, probably about Timothy's abilities and the profits they could generate. When Timothy's health started failing from the experimental treatments, Whitmore couldn't afford to lose his source of income. So he pushed harder, Janet said quietly. Even if it killed Timothy, the evidence was damning, but Sarah knew it wasn't enough to definitively prove murder. Too much time had passed. Too many records had been lost or destroyed. What they had was a compelling case for historical injustice, but not the kind of smoking gun that would force a complete reassessment of the official record. That changed on a Tuesday afternoon when Sarah received an unexpected phone call. "Dr. Chen, this is Harrison Whitmore. I believe you've been researching my ancestor, Dr. Marcus Whitmore, in connection with a case from 1892. Sarah's hand tightened on the phone. The voice was cultured, confident, with the slight edge of someone accustomed to being taken seriously. "Mr. Whitmore, how did you get my number? Dr. Chen, I think we should meet. My family has documents related to the Elijah Moore case that I believe would be of great interest to your research. Would you be available to meet in Boston this weekend?" Every instinct Sarah had developed during her academic career was screaming warnings. What kind of documents? The kind that would complete your understanding of what really happened in 1892. "Dr. Chen, my family has carried the burden of Marcus Whitmore's actions for over 150 years. Perhaps it's time for the complete truth to be told." Sarah agreed to meet Harrison at his office in downtown Boston, but she insisted that Janet and Miguel accompany her. If the Whitmore family was finally ready to reveal the truth about Timothy's death, she wanted witnesses. Whitmore Chin Pharmaceuticals occupied the top 3 floors of a glass tower overlooking Boston Harbor. The company's lobby featured a historical display about medical innovation in New England. But Sarah noticed that the timeline jumped from the Civil War directly to the 1880s, conveniently omitting the decade when Elijah Moore had lived and died. Whitmore IV was a man in his early 50s, impeccably dressed in a way that suggested both wealth and careful attention to image management. He greeted Sarah, Janet, and Miguel in a conference room whose floor-to-ceiling windows offered spectacular views of the harbor. But Sarah found herself focusing on the man rather than the scenery. "Dr. Chen, thank you for coming. And Ms. Morrison, Mr. Santos, I understand you've both been researching Elijah Moore as well. I appreciate your dedication to historical accuracy." Harrison placed a leather portfolio on the conference table between them. "Before I share what my family has preserved, I need you to understand the context. My great-great-grandfather Marcus Whitmore was a complex man living in complicated times. The Civil War had left him with what we would now recognize as trauma mental health issues. He was struggling financially, personally, and professionally. When Elijah Moore came into his life, Sarah kept her expression neutral, but inside she was seething. This sounded like the opening of a well-rehearsed defense, not a confession. Marcus saw Timothy's abilities as an opportunity, not just for profit, but for advancing medical science. He genuinely believed that understanding Timothy's gift could lead to breakthroughs that would help thousands of people. His intentions, at least initially, were honorable. Harrison opened the portfolio and withdrew a stack of documents that made Sarah's breath catch. They were the missing pages from Marcus Whitmore's journal, the entries that had been torn out of the copy Rose had preserved. These pages document Marcus's attempts to enhance Timothy's abilities through various treatments and medications, mercury compounds, electrical stimulation, dietary restrictions, methods that seem barbaric now, but were considered cutting-edge medicine. In 1892, Sarah accepted the pages with trembling hands. The handwriting was definitely Whitmore's, but the tone was completely different from the earlier journal entries. These pages read like the notes of a man conducting experiments on a laboratory animal, not treating a human patient. Subject shows increased responsiveness to mercurial treatments, though physical deterioration continues. Sarah read aloud. Must balance enhancement of abilities against preservation of subject's health. Investors becoming impatient with current rate of demonstration sessions. Miguel leaned forward. He's calling Timothy subject like he's an experiment. Harrison nodded grimly. The situation deteriorated rapidly in Timothy's final weeks. Marcus was under enormous pressure from the businessmen who had invested in what they believed would be a revolutionary medical breakthrough. When Timothy's health began failing, Marcus made increasingly desperate choices. Janet spoke for the first time since they'd arrived. "Are you telling us that Dr. Whitmore killed Elijah Moore?" Harrison was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the harbor. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Dr. Chen, what I'm about to tell you could destroy my family's reputation and possibly expose us to legal liability even after all these years. but I believe Elijah Moore deserves to have his story told honestly. He withdrew one final document from the portfolio. A letter written in Marcus Whitmore's handwriting, but clearly intended as a private confession rather than a medical record. Marcus wrote this letter to his wife 3 days before Timothy died. He never sent it, but my family has preserved it as a reminder of the consequences of putting profit before human compassion. Sarah read the letter silently, her horror growing with each sentence. Marcus Whitmore confessed to administering increasingly dangerous treatments to Timothy, driven by pressure from investors and his own financial desperation. He admitted that Timothy had begged to stop the sessions, that the boy had become too weak to walk without assistance, and that he continued the treatments anyway because he couldn't afford to disappoint the wealthy men who had funded his research. The final paragraph was devastating. I fear I have killed the very miracle I sought to preserve. Timothy grows weaker by the day, and I know my treatments are the cause, but I am trapped by my own greed and the expectations of others. God forgive me, I have become the very thing I once swore to oppose. A physician who harms rather than heals. Sarah looked up at Harrison, seeing the weight of generational guilt in his eyes. Why are you showing us this? Why now? Because, Harrison said quietly, my family built a fortune on the research Marcus conducted during those final weeks with Timothy. The pharmaceutical compounds we developed, the medical techniques we patented, all of it traces back to what Marcus learned while experimenting on a dying 12-year-old boy. We've been living with the profits of that exploitation for over 150 years. The conference room fell silent except for the distant sound of harbor traffic. Sarah felt the magnitude of what Harrison was revealing wash over her. This wasn't just historical injustice. It was an ongoing crime that had generated wealth and influence for multiple generations. What do you want from us? She asked. Harrison met her gaze directly. I want you to tell Timothy's complete story. All of it. And I want my family to finally make amends for what Marcus did. For the first time since discovering Timothy's photograph in Rosa's attic, Sarah felt that justice might actually be possible. But she also sensed that accepting Harrison's offer would set in motion events that none of them could control. Elijah Moore had been silenced by greed and exploitation 157 years ago. Now, finally, someone from the family that had profited from his death was offering to help restore his voice. The question was whether Sarah was prepared for the consequences of accepting that offer. The meeting with Harrison Whitmore had left Sarah feeling both vindicated and unsettled. For 3 days, she'd been processing the implications of his revelations while trying to decide how to proceed. The missing journal pages in Marcus Whitmore's confession letter provided the smoking gun she'd been seeking. But Harrison's willingness to expose his family's crimes seemed almost too good to be true. Her instincts were proved right when Miguel called her on Friday evening, his voice tight with worry. Sarah, I think we have a problem. I've been doing some research on Harrison Whitmore and his pharmaceutical company, and what I found doesn't match the story he told us. Sarah put Miguel on speakerphone in motion for Janet, who had been staying at her apartment while they planned their next moves, to listen in. What did you find? Whitmore Chin Pharmaceuticals isn't just a family business. It's a major player in the generic drug market, with annual revenues in the hundreds of millions. Harrison isn't just some guilty descendant trying to make amends. He's the CEO of a company that's currently facing multiple lawsuits over price manipulation and unsafe manufacturing practices. Sarah felt her stomach drop. Are you suggesting his confession was fake? I'm suggesting we need to be a lot more careful about trusting him. I did some digging into the company's recent history, and they've been involved in several cases where they've paid substantial settlements to keep negative information from becoming public. Janet leaned toward the phone. Miguel, what exactly are you thinking? I think Harrison Whitmore is trying to control the narrative around Timothy's story before we can go public with it. If he can frame his ancestors' crimes as a tragic mistake driven by good intentions, he might be able to minimize the damage to his family's reputation and his company's bottom line. Sarah's mind raced through the implications. If Miguel was right, then Harrison's apparent cooperation was actually a sophisticated damage control operation. By positioning himself as the repentant descendant eager to make amends, He could shape how Timothy's story was told while maintaining control over the most damaging evidence. There's something else, Miguel continued. I found out that Harrison's company has been quietly acquiring historical medical documents for the past several years, supposedly for a corporate museum project. But according to some of the sellers I tracked down, Whitmore Chin has been particularly interested in documents from the 1860s and 1870s. He's been trying to collect and suppress any evidence of Timothy's case, Sarah said, the pieces falling into place. That's why Janet kept getting calls from pharmaceutical company representatives. They weren't interested in Timothy's story. They were trying to buy up any evidence that could implicate the Whitmore family. Janet was quiet for a moment, then spoke with the careful precision of someone who had spent decades evaluating historical sources. If that's true, then we need to assume that Harrison's confession is unreliable. He may have shown us genuine documents, but he's controlling which documents we see and how we interpret them. Sarah felt the familiar frustration of a researcher who realizes she's been manipulated. But underneath the frustration was something else. A burning determination that reminded her why she'd become a historian in the first place. Elijah Moore had been exploited and silenced once by people who valued profit over truth. She wouldn't let it happen again. McGill, what would it take to independently verify the documents Harrison showed us? That's the thing. I don't think we can. Marcus Whitmore's original records would be in private family collections or institutional archives that Harrison's family probably controls. We'd be dependent on his cooperation to access the very evidence we need to fact-check his claims. Sarah stood and began pacing around her living room, thinking through their options. Then we need to build our case without relying on Harrison's evidence. We have Rose's journal, your family's letters, Janet's research, and testimonies from other families. Timothy helped. That should be enough to establish the basic facts of Timothy's story. But without the confession letter and the missing journal pages, we can't prove that Marcus Whitmore deliberately killed Timothy, Janet pointed out. We can show that Timothy was exploited and that he died under suspicious circumstances, but we can't make the case for murder. Maybe that's enough, Sarah said. Maybe it's more important to honor Timothy's memory and tell the story of his extraordinary gifts than it is to prove exactly how he died. But even as she said it, Sarah knew she didn't believe it. Timothy deserved more than a partial vindication. He deserved the complete truth, and the people responsible for his death deserved to be held accountable. Even if that accountability came 157 years after the fact. Miguel's voice interrupted her thoughts. Sarah, there might be another way. What if we could find evidence that Harrison's pharmaceutical company has been deliberately suppressing Timothy's story? If we could prove that Whitmore Chin has been systematically acquiring and hiding historical documents, that would be a story in itself. Industrial cover-up spanning multiple generations, Janet said slowly. A pharmaceutical company built on the profits of child exploitation, still actively working to hide their crimes. That's the kind of story that investigative journalists would be very interested in. Sarah felt a spark of hope. And if we could prove that Harrison was trying to manipulate us, it would actually strengthen our case. We'd have contemporary evidence of the Whitmore family's ongoing efforts to control Timothy's narrative. But how do we prove it? Miguel asked. The answer came to Sarah with sudden clarity. We give Harrison what he wants. We let him think he successfully manipulated us, and we see what he does next. If he's really trying to make amends, he'll follow through on his promises to help us tell Timothy's story. But if he's running a damage control operation, he'll try to shape our research in ways that minimize his family's culpability. Jeanette nodded approvingly. A controlled experiment with Harrison as the unwitting subject. I like it. Over the next hour, they developed a strategy that felt more like planning a sting operation than conducting historical research. Sarah would contact Harrison and express enthusiasm for his offer to help publicize Timothy's story. She would share selected portions of their research, carefully omitting any evidence that might threaten his narrative of Marcus Whitmore as a well-intentioned doctor who made tragic mistakes. Meanwhile, Miguel and Jeanette would continue their independent investigation, focusing on documenting Whitmore Chin's efforts to acquire historical documents and building relationships with other families whose ancestors had been connected to Timothy. If Harrison is genuine about making amends, This approach will give him every opportunity to prove it, Sarah said. But if he's trying to manipulate us, he'll reveal his true intentions when he thinks he has control over the story. As they finalized their plans, Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. Rose had preserved Timothy's journal and photograph for decades, waiting for someone who could tell his story properly. Now, Sarah was not just researching Timothy's life and death, she was potentially exposing a conspiracy that had lasted for over a century. Elijah Moore had trusted the adults in his life to protect him, and they had betrayed that trust in the most fundamental way possible. Sarah was determined to ensure that this time, the adults would do better, even if it meant going to war with one of New England's most powerful pharmaceutical companies. The game Harrison Whitmore thought he was controlling was about to become considerably more dangerous for everyone involved. But Sarah had learned something important from her months of grieving Rose's death. Some fights are worth having, regardless of the cost. Timothy deserved nothing less than the complete truth, and Sarah intended to make sure he finally got it. The 2 weeks following their decision to investigate Harrison Whitmore felt like preparation for battle. Sarah had transformed her apartment into a command center, with timeline charts covering her living room walls and document boxes stacked in every available space. Janet made the drive from Millbrook 3 times a week, bringing new research findings and helping to coordinate their growing network of family descendants who had been touched by Timothy's story. Mikkel had proved to be surprisingly adept at investigative research, using his connections in the construction industry to gather information about Whitmore Chen Pharmaceuticals that would never appear in public records. Through friends who had worked on the company's facility renovations, he'd learned about the executive floor's private archive room and the substantial security measures that protected whatever documents were stored there. They've got climate-controlled storage, motion sensors, and a security system that would make Fort Knox jealous, Miguel reported during one of their evening strategy sessions. That's not normal for corporate historical documents. Companies usually store that stuff in basement filing cabinets, not high-security vaults. Sarah had been playing her role as the naive academic perfectly, maintaining regular contact with Harrison and expressing gratitude for his family's willingness to cooperate with her research. But each conversation left her feeling more convinced that Miguel's suspicions were correct. Harrison's questions were too specific, his interest in her research methods too intense for someone who was simply trying to make amends for his ancestors' crimes. The breakthrough came when Janet discovered a pattern in the Historical Society's acquisition records that nobody had noticed before. "I've been going through our donation logs for the past 20 years, she explained, spreading record books across Sarah's dining room table. "Look at this. In 2003, we received a substantial donation from something called the New England Historical Preservation Foundation. They funded the digitization of our entire Civil War era collection." Sarah studied the records. "That sounds like a good thing." "It'd be, except for this." Janet pointed to a list of items that had been excluded from the digitization project. The Foundation specifically requested that any materials related to unconventional medical practices or faith healing from the 1860s not be included in the digital archive. They said those materials were historically unreliable and would diminish the scholarly value of the collection. Miguel looked up from his laptop, where he had been researching the Foundation. "Let me guess. The New England Historical Preservation Foundation has connections to Whitmore Chen Pharmaceuticals." "Better than that," Janet said with grim satisfaction. "The foundation was created and funded entirely by the Whitmore Family Trust. Harrison Whitmore III, Harrison's father, was the founding board chairman." Sarah felt the familiar chill that accompanied major discoveries. They've been systematically removing references to Timothy from historical archives for decades. This isn't just about protecting the family reputation. This is about erasing Timothy from history entirely. The implications were staggering. If the Whitmore family had been conducting this kind of historical manipulation for 20 years, how many other archives had been affected? How many documents had been quietly removed from public access or destroyed entirely? Janet's research had revealed similar patterns in historical societies across New England. The same foundations or closely related organizations had funded digitization projects and historical preservation efforts at institutions in Massachusetts, Vermont, Connecticut, in Maine, always with specific exclusions for materials related to alternative medicine or disputed medical cases from the post-Civil War period. They've been conducting a systematic campaign to erase Elijah Moore from the historical record, Sarah said, staring at the evidence spread across her table. And they've been doing it for decades. Miguel closed his laptop and looked at both women. The question is, what do we do about it? Sarah had been thinking about that question for days. Going public prematurely could result in legal challenges that would tie up their research for years. But waiting too long risked giving Harrison more time to counter their investigation or destroy additional evidence. The decision was made for them when Sarah received a phone call that changed everything. Dr. Chen, this is Dr. Patricia Reeves from the Smithsonian Institution. I understand you've been researching historical medical anomalies from the 1860s. Sarah's pulse quickened. The Smithsonian's involvement could lend credibility to their findings that no amount of Whitmore family manipulation could undermine. Dr. Reeves, yes, I've been investigating the case of Elijah Moore. How did you hear about my research? It's what I'm calling about. We've received an inquiry from Whitmore Chin Pharmaceuticals about donating their family's historical medical documents to our collection. They specifically mentioned documents related to a Elijah Moore case from 1892. They claimed these documents had been studied by an independent researcher, you, who had concluded that the case was historically significant. Sarah felt her blood turn to ice. Harrison wasn't just trying to control her research. He was using her credibility to legitimize his family's version of Timothy's story before she could challenge it. Dr. Reeves, I need to be very clear about something. I have not concluded my research, and I certainly haven't endorsed any version of Elijah Moore's story provided by the Whitmore family. In fact, I have serious concerns about the accuracy and completeness of their historical documents. It was a pause. Dr. Chen, would you be willing to present your findings to our historical review committee? If there are questions about the authenticity or interpretation of these documents, we need to understand them before we make any decisions about acquisition. Sarah looked at Janet and Miguel, both of whom had been listening to the conversation with growing alarm. This was it. The moment when their careful investigation would either vindicate Elijah Moore or be buried forever under the weight of Whitmore family influence and resources. Dr. Reeves, yes, I would very much like to present my findings to the Smithsonian, but I need you to understand that what I've discovered goes far beyond questions about a single historical case. I believe I have uncovered evidence of a systematic campaign to suppress and distort historical records. A campaign that has been ongoing for decades. That's a very serious allegation, Dr. Chen. Yes, it is, and I have the documentation to support it. After ending the call, Sarah sat in her living room surrounded by months of research, feeling the weight of responsibility heavier than ever. Elijah Moore had been failed by the adults who were supposed to protect him in 1892. Now, 157 years later, she had the chance to ensure that history didn't repeat itself, but success would require more than just good intentions and solid research. It would require the courage to take on a powerful family and a wealthy corporation that had been controlling Timothy's narrative for generations. Janet reached over and squeezed Sarah's hand. Rose would be proud of you. Miguel nodded. Timothy deserves to have his story told honestly. All of it. Sarah took a deep breath and looked at the photograph of Elijah Moore that she'd propped against a lamp on her coffee table. The boy's eyes, one blue, one green, so much like Rose's, seemed to be looking directly at her, waiting patiently for the justice that had been denied him for so long. Tomorrow, I call Dr. Reeves back and schedule our presentation, Sarah said. It's time to tell Timothy's complete story to people who have the power to ensure it's never suppressed again. The battle for Elijah Moore's legacy was about to begin in earnest. And for the first time since discovering his journal in Rose's attic, Sarah felt ready for the fight. The Smithsonian's Museum Support Center in Suitland, Maryland, was not where Sarah had imagined making the most important presentation of her career. The sprawling complex of research facilities and storage warehouses felt more like an industrial park than a temple of American history. But she understood that the real work of preserving the past often happened far from the marble halls and glass cases that the public associated with the Smithsonian Institution. Dr. Patricia Reeves had assembled an impressive review committee for their presentation. 2 historians specializing in 19th century American medicine, a curator from the National Museum of American History, a genealogy expert, and, most importantly, a forensic document analyst who could evaluate the authenticity of the materials both sides would be presenting. Harrison Whitmore had arrived with his own team, 2 lawyers, a corporate historian, and a briefcase full of documents that Sarah suspected represented the Whitmore family's most compelling evidence for their version of Timothy's story. He greeted Sarah with the same polished courtesy he'd shown in Boston, but she could see tension in his eyes that hadn't been there before. "Dr. Chen, thank you for agreeing to this joint presentation. I think it will be beneficial for everyone to hear all perspectives on Elijah Moore's case." Sarah nodded politely, but inside she was steeling herself for what she knew would be the fight of her academic life. Janet and Miguel flanked her at the conference table, their months of research organized in clearly labeled binders that represented hundreds of hours of careful documentation. Dr. Reeves opened the session by outlining the Smithsonian's interest in the Elijah Moore materials. "We've been approached by Whitmore Chen Pharmaceuticals about accepting a donation of historical documents related to a 19th century medical case. However, Dr. Chen has raised questions about the accuracy and completeness of these materials. Our goal today is to evaluate all available evidence and determine whether the Smithsonian should move forward with acquiring these documents." Harrison spoke first, presenting a compelling narrative that portrayed his ancestor as a well-intentioned physician who had been overwhelmed by the complexity of Timothy's case. He showed the committee Marcus Whitmore's original journal entries, the missing pages that documented his attempts to treat Timothy, and the confession letter that painted the doctor as a man consumed by guilt over his failure to save the boy. "My family has preserved these documents for over 150 years because we believe they represent an important chapter in American medical history," Harrison concluded. Elijah Moore possessed remarkable healing abilities that challenged the scientific understanding of his time. "My great-great-grandfather made mistakes in his treatment approach, mistakes that ultimately contributed to Timothy's death. But his intentions were to help the boy and advance medical knowledge for the benefit of humanity. It was a masterful performance," Sarah had to admit, had presented Marcus Whitmore as a tragic figure rather than a villain, someone whose good intentions had been corrupted by circumstances beyond his control. The confession letter in particular seemed to support this interpretation, a doctor's anguished admission of failure rather than evidence of deliberate exploitation. Now it was Sarah's turn. She began with Timothy himself, using the testimonials collected by Janet and Miguel to paint a picture of a 12-year-old boy whose extraordinary gifts had drawn people from across New England. She shared Roberto Santos's letters, Emma Morrison's detailed accounts, and testimonies from other families whose ancestors had been healed by Timothy's touch. Elijah Moore was not just a medical curiosity, Sarah told the committee. He was a child who used his remarkable abilities to help anyone who came to him, regardless of their social status, race, or ability to pay. The evidence shows that he never refused to help someone in need, even when his own health was declining. Then she presented the evidence of systematic suppression that Janet had uncovered. The New England Historical Preservation Foundation's funding of digitization projects, the specific exclusions for materials related to Timothy's case, the pattern of document removal that had continued for decades. The Whitmore family hasn't just been preserving their ancestors' documents, Sarah said, her voice growing stronger as she laid out the evidence. They've been conducting a systematic campaign to control Timothy's narrative and suppress evidence that challenges their preferred version of events. Miguel stood and addressed the committee directly. "My family preserved Roberto Santos' letters for over 150 years. Because Roberto made us promise to keep Timothy's story alive. Roberto saw how Dr. Whitmore was treating Timothy in his final weeks, not as a patient to be healed, but as a resource to be exploited. Roberto tried to help Timothy, but Whitmore wouldn't allow it. Edward presented her documentation of the historical societies that had been affected by Whitmore family funding, showing how materials related to Timothy had been systematically excluded from public archives across New England. The forensic document analyst had been examining materials from both sides throughout the presentations. When called upon for her assessment, her findings were damning for Harrison's case. The confession letter attributed to Marcus Whitmore shows signs of having been written significantly later than 1892, she reported. The paper stock, ink composition, and handwriting characteristics are consistent with documents from the early 20th century, not the Civil War era. While the other Whitmore documents appear to be genuine period pieces, this confession letter appears to be a later fabrication. The room fell silent. Harrison's face went pale as the implications sank in. His family's most compelling evidence for Marcus Whitmore's good intentions was a fake, probably created decades after Timothy's death to provide a more sympathetic narrative for future generations. Dr. Reeves looked at Harrison with a mixture of disappointment and professional interest. "Mr. Whitmore, can you explain how your family came to possess a fabricated document?" Harrison's composure finally cracked. We've always been told that letter was authentic. My grandfather showed it to me when I was a child, said it proved that Marcus Whitmore wasn't the monster some people claimed he was. But you knew the letter supported your preferred narrative, Sarah said quietly. You used it to try to convince me that your ancestor was a victim of circumstances rather than a perpetrator of child abuse. Harrison looked around the room, seeing his carefully constructed defense falling apart. Dr. Chen, you don't understand the pressure my family has lived under. For over a century, we've known that Marcus Whitmore exploited Elijah Moore. We've built our fortune on research conducted during Timothy's final weeks, research that killed him. Do you have any idea what it's like to live with that knowledge? Then why not tell the truth? Miguel asked. Why spend decades trying to suppress Timothy's story instead of honoring his memory? Harrison's answer revealed the depth of his family's moral corruption, because admitting the truth would destroy everything we've built. The pharmaceutical patents, the medical techniques, the corporate reputation, all of it traces back to what Marcus learned while experimenting on Timothy. We couldn't survive that kind of exposure. Dr. Reeves had heard enough. Mr. Whitmore, the Smithsonian will not be accepting your family's document donation. Furthermore, I'm recommending that our legal department investigate whether your attempts to donate fabricated documents constitute fraud. But Sarah wasn't finished. Dr. Reeves, I'd like to propose something else. The Smithsonian should create a permanent exhibit about Elijah Moore, not as a medical curiosity, but as a victim of exploitation who deserves to be remembered for his extraordinary compassion and generosity. His story should be told completely and honestly, including the crimes committed against him. Dr. Reeves nodded approvingly. Dr. Chen, I think that's an excellent idea. Would you be willing to serve as the lead curator for such an exhibit? Sarah looked at Janet and Miguel, seeing pride and determination in their faces. Then she looked at the photograph of Elijah Moore that she'd brought with her, the image that had started this entire journey. Yes, she said. I think Timothy has waited long enough for his story to be told properly. Harrison Whitmore left the meeting in defeat, his decades-long family conspiracy finally exposed. But Sarah felt no satisfaction in his downfall. The real victory was simpler and more profound. Elijah Moore would finally receive the recognition and respect he'd been denied for over 150 years. Rose had been right to preserve his story, and she'd been right to trust that someday the right person would come along to tell it. Sarah just wished Rose could have lived to see this moment, to know that her lifelong vigil over Timothy's memory had finally succeeded. Some stories, Sarah realized, are too important to stay buried, no matter how long it takes to bring them to light. 6 months later, Sarah stood in the National Museum of American History, surrounded by visitors who had come to see the Elijah Moore exhibit on its opening day. The display occupied a prominent corner of the museum's medical history section, with Timothy's photograph serving as the centerpiece of an installation that told his complete story with the dignity and respect he'd been denied in life. Janet and Miguel flanked her, both wearing the slightly overwhelmed expressions of people who had never expected their weekend research project to result in a Smithsonian exhibit. The past half-year had been a whirlwind of media attention, academic conferences, and legal proceedings as the full scope of the Whitmore family's historical manipulation had come to light. Harrison Whitmore had ultimately avoided criminal charges, but Whitmore Chen Pharmaceuticals had faced a public relations disaster that resulted in congressional hearings and significant financial penalties. More importantly, the company had been forced to establish the Elijah Moore Foundation, funding medical research focused on pediatric care and children's rights, ensuring that Timothy's legacy would be one of healing rather than exploitation. Look at that. Miguel said, pointing to a group of children gathered around the interactive timeline display. "They're actually learning about Timothy's story. Roberto would be so proud." Janet nodded, her eyes bright with tears she didn't try to hide. Emma Morrison's letters are right there, in a national museum, being read by people who will remember Timothy's kindness. It's what Emma always hoped would happen someday. Sarah watched the visitors, families, students, tourists, as they moved through the exhibit, many pausing to read the testimonials from people Timothy had healed. The display didn't shy away from the difficult parts of his story, but it framed his death as a tragedy that had ultimately led to important conversations about medical ethics and the protection of vulnerable patients. A young girl, maybe 10 years old, stopped in front of Timothy's photograph and stared at it with the intense focus that children sometimes bring to things that capture their imagination. "Mom," she said, tugging on her mother's sleeve, "why did the bad doctor hurt him? If he was just trying to help people." The mother knelt beside her daughter, reading from the exhibit text. "Sometimes people make terrible choices when they care more about money than about doing what's right. But Timothy's story helps us remember to always protect children and make sure they're safe." Sarah felt Rose's presence more strongly than she had since discovering the journal in the attic. This was what Rose had been waiting for. Not just academic vindication or historical justice, but the simple human recognition that Elijah Moore had been a remarkable child whose life mattered, whose story deserved to be remembered. As the museum visitors continued to flow through the exhibit, Sarah made a quiet promise to the boy in the photograph. Timothy's story would continue to be told, completely and honestly, for as long as people cared about protecting children and honoring those who used their gifts to help others. Some lights, Sarah thought, looking at Timothy's gentle smile in the photograph, burned bright enough to illuminate the world for generations. If someone is brave enough to tend the flame, Rose had tended that flame for 60 years. Now it was Sarah's turn to carry it forward.